Welcome back to the series. In the last video, we covered the data layer, where basically we showed how to collect this data or fetch this data from a Strapi backend and display them in the front end, implementing SSG or static site generation. We pretty much walked through this whole flow from Strapi, and then we had our services handing over to data layer and our main pages using this getStaticProps function, which actually is responsible for SSG and ISR. And we hinted a little bit that this is the part where we do a data handoff. Basically, whatever data we collect during build time, we just hand it off to this component. This is actually restaurant page content, but I had to shorten it a little bit. So this is where all the content is held. This is the page, right? Once we hand over the data to this content, that's when Redux takes over and this happens. In this video, we're going to go over this whole process of the front end state management with Redux. So we start with the store. This is the Redux data store. This is the one responsible for handling all the data. And this is what the restaurant page content would look like. Here we're going to declare some filters, and inside an use effect, we're going to pass that data that we just collected, the initial restaurant, basically this guy right here, and invoke this function, setRestaurant. And this is actually a function which is in Redux. And this function actually sets all the data collected from the backend and hands over to Redux, the restaurant slice, which we will go step by step in this video. So once this data is handed off, that's when the store takes over, which is basically covered all over the app. So what happens is now all our subcomponents like search form, switch button, the checkbox group, etc., as you can see here. See, this is the search form, this is our switch button, this is our checkbox groups. So all this functionality that's happening, it's actually done by Redux because as soon as we click these, the event gets launched, and that event makes Redux to invoke different functions like these guys: set search term, toggled featured, add quiz-in term, etc., etc. And where they're coming from? They're coming from right here. This is basically a repeatable Redux structure. You can do this on any collection you like. Like we're going to describe the restaurants here. You can have posts, you can have reviews, contacts, etc., etc. So this is how Redux tells us to organize our data, like features, and then you put collection after collection, and then inside that there will be files like restaurant slice. This is what manages the state. And I have one extra one, restaurant filter slice, because this is where I'm managing all the filter states. And then according to these changes or method invocation, it actually launches a request to this file, API restaurant. And this is where we make a connection to the backend, like API/restaurant by search. And you have to notice that these are not necessarily the Strapi backend. This is the Next.js backend, because Next.js is a full stack framework. It has a front end side and a back end side. So through these, we're making a call to the data layer, and that's where we have our methods and functions, as we showed in the last video, via the data source. And that's what connects to the Strapi and makes the changes according to these events. And this API gives us nice little hooks like use get rest query. Rest means basically restaurant query. use lazy restaurant query, etc., and it takes filters as arguments. And these hooks we go ahead and use in our components to invoke these functions that we created in this slice. So now let's go to the code and start right here at the store structure. All right, so we are back at the code, and right here we have a Redux store, and here I have a easier, simple sample here. This is what a normal store should look like. Let's say if we are working with the posts collection, then we can just bring in posts like that and use the reducer, and then have the middleware and add the middleware like this, and then set up the listener. This will launch the store and be done with it. But in our case, it will look a little bit more complex, just because we're bringing in this extra library called Redux Persist, only because we are handling auth here, authentication. So no matter how we handle the state in the memory, that's not going to work in the authentication case, because if we do that and not persist this authentication information locally in the local storage or maybe the session storage, then what's going to happen is once you refresh the application, the user will be logged out. It's not going to be persistent, right? Okay, so now we're going to focus on just these guys, like API restaurant, the restaurant slice, and restaurant filter slice reducer, because we're going to just focus on restaurant collection. And look, as you can see, these guys, see the API one is set up right here, and the other two, these slices, restaurants and restaurant filters like this. And right here we configure everything with the persistence, and two middlewares get added, API restaurant and API auth. And then we are just exporting the persister, and that becomes our store. And once it is ready, we actually go under pages and go under app.tsx, and this is where you'll see that we have this provider with store as an argument is covering up the entire application. Provider is coming from React Redux, and that's how we are bootstrapping Redux with our whole application. Okay, so now that we have seen how the store works and configured, and we also saw that the store is covering up the whole application, controlling all the state management. So now let's track down the rest of the setup, like here. Under features and restaurants, let's go look at the restaurant slice, restaurant filter slice, and the API restaurant, which will actually make the calls to the backend. Okay, so we are back at the code, and now let's look at features, restaurants, and see what's there. And we find API restaurant, restaurant filter slice, and restaurant slice. So let's start here. So this is the restaurant slice, and by slice I mean in Redux it's basically like the useState hook. When we use useState, we have an initial state, and then it also gives us a method to update that state. Like say, let's say if it was restaurant, then the method would be setRestaurant, right? So this is just a larger version of that, where we get to create our own functions. This also starts with the initial state, whole data structure here, and then we feed this to the slice. We name it the restaurant, and then initial state, and then we create some reducers, and this is what will be responsible for the state change. An action payload is basically when an event happens, let's say at the very beginning, right here. See, once we get this data handoff from here, we get this data through getStaticProps during the build time, right? The static data. And then come here and we hand it off to through a use effect, and we call this setRestaurant and pass this data, the initial restaurant data or the list. And this is the function that is responsible. And action.payload would be that initial data. So this is where everything begins. And then let's look at the restaurant filter slice. Now here, if you look at this data set, you'll see it's the search term, sort order number, cuisine ID, etc., right? Which actually matches all these guys, right? The filters, the search box, the sorting. So all these events are going to be taken care of by this guy. So here also we are declaring an initial state, and accordingly we're setting up all these functions to make the state changes. As soon as these states change, the events got launched. Also here, like the reset, right? Look at all the data, all the information. Everything is set to false and empty, right? So here, if I hit the reset results, everything comes back to normal. We clicked on here, an event got launched, and this guy sent a request to this guy. And this is the API restaurant file. And this is where we set up all our API calls using create API. And we get that from Redux Toolkit. And as you can see here, we just, let's say if we want to get restaurant by location, we just make a call to /restaurant by location and then pass this ID. And in this case, we're making a call to restaurant by search filters and sending all our filter data with it. And once everything's said and done, Redux gives us nice little hooks like get, use, restaurant query, lazy query, etc. And now that we have covered this, let me quickly show you what this one is about, like the restaurants by search filter. And this is what our Redux API making the call to, sending the search filter query, and this guy then turns around and calls the data layer, basically data source dot get all restaurant by search filters. And this part we covered last time as we saw how we set up all our functions and methods inside the data layer. So let's track this down. Let's go inside the data layer right here, and let's go under restaurant.ts. And this is where we had all our functions. Mostly these guys will be called during build time. These are all backend server-side functions, except for this guy, because this guy will be taking requests from our Redux library. So this is what our get all restaurants by search filter look like. Basically, this is what is happening right now. According to any events launched by these two slices, Redux is making a call to this API, and this API is making a call to our local API endpoint, and this endpoint then talking to the data source in the data layer, and data layer then talking to this Strapi database, just like we've seen before in the previous video when we described how data layer works. So right here we are seeing like this is the search filter query being passed to this function, and depending on that, we are updating every single filter like a cuisine array, location array, etc. And this whole thing is pretty much forming a query, QS query with QS library. With QS.stringify, we can actually make this whole query readable. Normally, see, this is what the query should look like. Let me make it larger a little bit. See, by the time it hits Strapi, this is what it looks like. Look, question mark, sort equals name, blah, 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 filter, this, that, the other. I mean, it's very, very ugly. It's almost unreadable, right? And with QS query or QS library, QS.stringify, we just turn the whole thing into nice little readable chunks. And then in the end, we just take the whole thing as a string and pass it as an argument to our restaurant service.getAll function. At this point, restaurant service is the data service object, and .getAll is the generic getAll function that we created in the HTTP service. All these were described in great details in our previous video. So this is how all this filtration happening, straight from the Strapi backend all the way to our Redux-based front end. Now let's go check out how we are actually using this on the front end page, by which I mean right here, this file. All right, so this is the page basically we want to track down right now, because this is the one doing all this filtering and utilizing the Redux functionalities. So let's track it down. All right, so let's look under pages and restaurant, and as you can see, this should be the single page for the restaurant item, and this is the list page. And this is exactly where we stopped last time. I mean, on the last video where we were discussing the data layer. So now let's go deep. Let's find out where this guy is coming from. Show all page content. So it should be under components, page view, restaurants, show all page content. So as you can see right here, we are actually collecting the restaurant information on the list of restaurants from Strapi and handing it over to this component right here. Now, this component, we just received this as an argument or a prop, initial restaurants. So once we get this, first thing we do, have two use effects deployed. We implement two use effects. The first one we call the setRestaurant function that we found under this slice. Let's find out features, restaurant, and this restaurant slice. This is where this setRestaurants method is coming from. And this is the reducer where we just get the restaurant list as action payload and update the state.restaurants. Go back here. So this is how the journey begins. As soon as we give it to Redux, what we do is we then come here and pass that data collected from Redux to this restaurant list page, to this restaurant list component. And this restaurant list component is what actually hosting all these, this block right here. So now that the data is coming from Redux, so the next thing we do, and here we're trying to implement a refetch after a user event, like a click on a checkbox or a filter button, etc. And here, inside this use effect, we're blocking it from reloading it for the first time, because since there is no change, once the page loads, nothing's going to happen. But until somebody hits something, a data filter changes, that's when we invoke this getRestaurant function, and which is basically coming from the feature and API restaurant right here, getRestaurants. See? And getRestaurants will only be invoked when anything or any state in this filter item changes. As you can see here, based on that, we're updating our entire query, plus equals. So we're going to send the entire query, and we're going to return it upon invocation of this method. And when we do, our data changes according to the filters, and we utilize this function in this restaurant filter slice. And this is what we saw before, that here we have all the filters initial state, and we have all the reducers or methods implemented, so that according to user input or user event, all these states are going to change. And as they change, they launch an event and invoke this guy, and this guy then makes the call to this URL, this URL endpoint, restaurants by search filter. So let's find that guy. It's under API, restaurant by search filters, and this guy then takes the query, search filter query, and passes it along to the data layer using data source dot get all restaurants by search filters method. And now let's go back to the data layer. We're just tracking back. We already went over this. So let's reset here and find the data layer and restaurant.ts. And here we find our get all restaurants by search filters method. And here we are taking that query, thus making the necessary calls to our backend via restaurant service.getAll and sending this query as a string. And this eventually calls up our service, HTTP service here. Right here, the get all query. And this guy then utilizes Strapi client, which is right here. And then Strapi client then collects the API key and URL from our .env file and make the call to the Strapi backend, and thus finishing the whole circle. Now, before I finish, I just want to go over this guy a little bit. Here we are seeing filtering methods, but everything is based on data fetching though, right? No CRUD functionality is going on. At this point in this application, I haven't implemented them yet, because when it comes to the comments, and such, we actually need to update the comment or create the comment and delete comment, etc. But for that kind of CRUD functionality, we can use this Redux API, by which I mean this create API function. And I have a sample here just to show you, like, let's say we set feature, and you can see reviews, right? Reviews or comments. So here I have something set up, API reviews, and here you can see that I have two mutations. When we go into CRUD, they're going to be mutations, just like this. And we have a local backend, which is the Next.js backend created, /create comment, and we're sending a post request with data, and here /delete comment, and we're sending a delete method with data. And let's go find these URLs under pages, API, and right here, create comments. We invoke post method, and using the Strapi client, we're sending a post request to /comment, and this is actually the endpoint in the Strapi backend, and the data it's receiving, and we are using a authorization JWT token, which we have in our header, because we're using a HTTP only cookie, which is server-based cookie. We do not write our cookies locally on the browsers, because that is not very secure. Getting that cookie from the header and passing that JWT token as an authorization token, so that we can actually make a post request. Same here, delete comments. In here, we're also sending a delete method. And this time we are using /comment/id URL endpoint. And same way we're sending this JWT token and performing the delete operation. So this is how we can actually handle all the CRUD functionality between our application front end versus Strapi backend using something like this, Redux mutation functions. And as usual, Redux gives us nice little hooks back so that we can take them to our application front end and use them to perform the CRUD task. With that, I conclude this video where we just went over the front end layer, state management with Redux, and went over the whole process from beginning to end. On our next video, we will cover how to create advanced data filters and data fetching queries using the QS library. Thanks for watching.